Wampanoag Confederacy, the sachems upheld the law. They negotiated treaties. They controlled contact with foreigners as well. They collected tribute from other smaller villages, declared war, provided for widows and orphans, especially those who became widows and orphans because of wars. They allocated farmland if there were disputes about land. And usually the Patuxet sachem, this relatively small village of Patuxet, the sachem there would owe fealty to a great sachem in a larger Wampanoag village, and through him would owe the same sort of fealty to higher level sachems of the Allied confederations, the Nausets and the Massachusetts. Their enemies were the Narragansett and the Pequots to the west into what is today Rhode Island, and then further north into what is today Maine, the Abenaki. Sachems had some control then, and a lot of responsibility, but they had to build consensus for their actions. They didn't have the powers of a prince or a king or something like that. They had to actually get the people to go along with what they were doing. So by the year 1600 then, New England, it's estimated, has about 100,000 people, Native Americans, and is growing, and it's actually growing fairly rapidly. Coastal towns in particular are booming, and this leads to a push for a stronger government, and we start to see some changes in the way these communities are governed right around this time. Food supplies, in order to feed this growing population, need to be managed a little bit more carefully. Political tensions develop, and armed conflict seems to have gotten to be more frequent. So again, right before the arrival of the English settlers at Plymouth, you have this period of increasing tension, conflict, and rapidly changing political situations as well. Again, though, the armed conflict that we're talking about here is not really that bloody, not sustained, not as complete, not as total a kind of warfare as what we see in Europe during these years, when you have these ongoing battles of religion and wars between these emerging nations in Europe, where thousands and thousands of people are dying. We're talking about small, controlled conflicts, raids back and forth, avenging insults, gaining status, taking captives to replenish the population, things like that. But very small scale war compared to what Europeans are used to and are engaging in at that time. So long before the Pilgrims arrive, you have British fishing vessels that are fishing off the coast of Newfoundland way back in the 1480s, even before Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean in 1492. And you have British fishing vessels, English fishing vessels off the coast of New England by the early 1500s. By 1501, a Portuguese captain kidnapped more than 50 Indians from what is today Maine, and he found that two of the captives that he had taken were wearing items that were clearly from Venice, Italy. And this meant that they had had some contact with Europeans before. Otherwise, how would they have gotten these things from Venice? So we know that there's earlier contacts that just simply aren't documented. We don't have any strong evidence other than these artifacts that are discovered later on. But certainly well before the 1500s, there are European and Native American contacts in North America. Giovanni Verrazzano, a mariner for hire who sailed under a lot of different flags, at one point sailed for the French and for the French king, and sailed north from the Carolinas, what is today North and South Carolina, and went along the coast up to New England. And he wrote in his journal that the coast was densely populated all the way up, and always smoky with fires, that there was never a point along that entire Atlantic coast where there weren't people. He anchored in Narragansett Bay near Providence in the 1520s. And when he did, Narragansett canoes surrounded his ship, and the local sachem leaped aboard his ship And Verrazano wrote that he was a tall, long-haired man of about 40, with beautiful jewelry around his neck and his ears, as beautiful of stature and build as I can possibly describe. And this echoes the descriptions that other European explorers wrote about their experiences in New England and along the Atlantic coast, meeting other Native American people. One common feature that was mentioned was the height. That Native Americans were apparently much taller than Europeans at that time, which makes sense, and much stronger, much more muscular. Their diet was better. They had not been exposed to the diseases that Europeans had, and so they naturally appeared healthier as well as bigger and stronger. They're also, described as being nearly naked, though interestingly, that wasn't really a thing. Even the Pilgrims, and the later Puritans in Massachusetts didn't really remark much upon the nakedness so much as they were put off by the adornments, the jewelry, the face makeup, which seemed to them to be kind of garish and extravagant. The nakedness didn't bother them so much. Hairstyles, were particularly extravagant, and men commonly shaved off one half of their hair and left the other half long or cut into patterns. And it's kind of funny, but apparently in the early 1600s in London, young men and boys copied some of these Native American hairstyles, and these became fashionable for young men to kind of shave one side and do something else with the other side they imagined to be, Native American. From the Native American perspective, these European arrivals in New England seemed pretty stupid and dirty, weak, small, and certainly no one that they needed to worry about or fear. Most of these early explorers from England, France, had never bathed. Bathing was not a thing for Europeans in those days, whereas for Native Americans, bathing was a regular practice, almost a ritualistic kind of practice. Indians also remarked on how disgusting handkerchiefs were, that they couldn't believe that these English and French people would blow their snot into a rag and then put that in their pocket. Other early contacts then, usually what we see is Native Americans not allowing Europeans onto shore. They insisted on conducting trade in boats. Further north, where contact had happened earlier, going up to Newfoundland, by the year 1600, Indians were refusing to come in contact with Europeans at all, which might reflect some understanding of the spread of disease, at least a limited understanding that people were getting sick because of contact with Europeans. And so when they did trade, they passed goods back and forth by rope rather than actually touching Europeans in person. By the late 1500s, Europeans were regularly trading with New England, the Dawnland region, including Patuxet, fishing, trading, sometimes kidnapping and raiding. By 1610, which is 10 years still before the Pilgrims arrived, Britain had 200 vessels, fishing vessels that were operating off of New England and Newfoundland. And as late as 1606, Samuel de Champlain, the French explorer, visited Cape Cod and reported back that it was too densely populated to establish any settlements there. And what we'll see is this will change very rapidly, and that population will disappear within a few years. In 1607, a British colony was established in Maine, with more people than the Pilgrims would send to Plymouth, but the local Indian population killed 11 of the colonists, and then the rest of them took off. Typical also was the experience of a British trader that stopped at Patuxet in 1603, traded, socialized for a little bit, and the locals surrounded their camp with armed warriors and kind of said, it's time for you to leave. Native Americans, in other words, had the upper hand in most of these kind of interactions. Then in 1614, a small ship stopped at Patuxet, and a very small man, very short man with a huge red beard, Captain John Smith, who you may know from Pocahontas fame, was the leader of this ship. And Tisquantum and his people in Patuxet treated Smith very well, and then eventually did their thing and said, okay, it's time for you to go. Smith went back to England, and he talked to Prince Charles about giving English names to these native villages that they've encountered in New England. And this is how Patuxet became Plymouth. Captain Smith's lieutenant, Thomas Hunt, stayed in Maine and finished loading dried fish, which was then taken back to England. He decided to visit Patuxet again, invited the friendly Indians that he had met before on board the ship, and several dozen of them went out and did, a day of sailing. And then Hunt's men forced them into the hold of the ship, and when they resisted, Hunt's men opened fire and slaughtered apparently dozens of them. The survivors, which included Tisquantum, were then forced below into the hold. So Tisquantum and about 20 others who had survived were then joined at Cape Cod by 7 Nauset captives, and then this essentially marks the end of friendly relations. And after that, the Wampanoag Confederacy and the Nauset Confederacy both refused to trade anymore with the English. A couple years after that, a French ship landed wrecked near what is today Provincetown in the end of Cape Cod, and the Nauset picked them off one by one until the last 5 of them surrendered, and then they were captured and sent to live in villages that had been victimized by European kidnappers, English kidnappers, as sort of replacement people. Another French ship anchored in what today is Boston Harbor, and again, the Massachusetts in that case killed everybody on board and burned the ship. So we can see that relations have really deteriorated quickly in the 1610s. So Tisquantum is gone for 5 years, and when he comes back, Patuxet is gone, his home village is gone, and Plymouth was in its place. And what happened in those 5 years is Tisquantum was taken first to Spain, and Hunt tried to sell him into slavery in Spain along with the other captives. But at this point, Spanish priests have for a long time been pushing back against Indian slavery. This goes back to the early 1500s, and de las Casas arguments against slavery when he first visits the lands that Columbus and his men have taken, and sees the slavery that Native Americans have been forced into. And so by this point, there are a lot of Catholic priests who are actively fighting against the Indian slave trade in the Spanish Empire. So when this English vessel shows up with all these native people to sell them into slavery, these Spanish priests intervene and seize the remaining captives. And again, this included Tisquantum. So they try to convert the captives to Christianity, to Catholicism, and Tisquantum apparently convinces the priest that he's a willing convert, and but he wants to go home. He doesn't want to stay in Spain. There's no direct flight back to Patuxet, obviously. So he first gets to London, manages to get from Spain to England, and in London he makes a friend with a shipbuilder named John Slaney, who taught him to speak English and helped him out in other ways, obviously. And eventually Tisquantum manages to arrange for his own passage to North America, working on a fishing vessel. He ends up in Newfoundland, which is still 1,000 miles away from Patuxet, and he's separated by his enemies, the Abenaki and also the Micmacs. But Tisquantum in Newfoundland meets a guy named Thomas Dermer, who was worked for Captain John Smith too, and convinces him that he can go with him to New England, and they can get rich together because Tisquantum's got the contacts, and they can make a fortune. They start to negotiate with London, and they contract 2 ships for trade, but they have to go back to London to do this. And so Dermer and Tisquantum go back to England. You can just imagine at this point in his life, that Tisquantum, taken from his village, going to Spain, to England, to Newfoundland, now back to England again. But finally, they go back to Maine with the new ship, and they sail from Maine to Patuxet. Tisquantum and Dermer both were shocked as they came down the coast, that all the villages, all the coastal inhabitants were gone. And Dermer reported this as utterly void. There was nothing left. Overgrown fields, skeletons lying exposed to the sun. It was described as a cemetery 200 miles long and 40 miles deep. When they arrive in Patuxet, there's not a single person left. Tisquantum and Dermer set off in search for signs of life, and eventually they do find a small village of survivors who had come from other villages together, led by a sachem named Massasoit. It's estimated, the best guess really is that viral hepatitis spread by contaminated food is what killed everybody. But basically the story is the same all over North America at this point, in the Caribbean too, that as Native Americans were exposed to diseases from Europe and or from Africa that they had not been exposed to before, their populations are just decimated. These are illnesses that Europeans have been exposed to for centuries, if not millennia, and have developed some immunities to it within the population, but not the Native Americans. So the epidemic kills, within the space of just 3 or 4 years, about 90% of the people of the Dawnland of coastal New England. There are very few survivors amongst the Wampanoag. They're no match for the Narragansett further west, who had largely been spared from this epidemic. And so there's a real crisis for the Wampanoag. Tisquantum goes back to Maine, later walks back again, and was seized as a prisoner and sent to Massasoit as a captive. But Tisquantum convinced Massasoit that as a speaker of English, he could now go and talk to English traders and fishing vessels and forge an alliance between the English and the Wampanoag that would preserve them from the Narragansett. And this is the context then, finally, in which the Puritans arrive in 1620. They set up their town essentially by using the ruins left by the village of Patuxet, looting the graves, using the abandoned houses to help them survive, especially in that first awful winter. Only half of them do survive, but Massasoit decides that he will send Squanto out to try to befriend them and make military allies of them. Massasoit tried to bluff, pretend that he was a more powerful ruler than he was, telling the Pilgrims that he would spare them only if they allied with him against the Narragansett. Massasoit really wanted an English settlement that would offer him some protection, because he figured that the Narragansett, who traded with the English in Narragansett Bay, would not want to attack Plymouth because they would risk losing their trade with the English in Narragansett. Tisquantum makes himself, absolutely indispensable to the Pilgrims, because he is also not loving his arrangement as a captive working for Massasoit. And so he tries to stay at Plymouth with the Pilgrims, and he's the one who teaches them how to farm in North America and helps them to survive, but he's hoping that they'll offer him some protection as well. It all works out well enough that, by the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims are doing okay, and they hold that famous Feast of Thanksgiving. Massasoit arrives with 90 people, mostly warriors. They bring their weapons. They make a nice show of force. Then the Pilgrims come and they march around their little militia, shoot their guns into the air and try to convey that they're powerful too. And then they all sit down and eat a lot of food together and complain about how awful the Narragansett Indians are. And that's Thanksgiving, right? That's what we still do every November. Tisquantum's still around. He continues to lobby other Wampanoag, and he's trying to take Massasoit's position as sachem of the surviving Wampanoag. He also tries to convince the Pilgrims that Massasoit is a bad guy who's going to attack them at some point. And he's got all sorts of plots that, we know some of these, and just one, in 1622, he leaves Plymouth, and then sends a messenger to come to Plymouth that the message is that Massasoit is planning to attack. The plot doesn't work, and everybody, Massasoit, the Pilgrims, everybody's mad at Tisquantum for trying to manipulate them this way. Massasoit's outraged and demands that the Pilgrims send him Tisquantum for immediate execution. But like I said, Tisquantum had made himself indispensable, and the Pilgrims, really needed him. And where else were they going to find someone who spoke English like he did, and could teach them all about survival in New England? And so Massasoit sends Governor Bradford, the leader of the colony, a knife, like a knife in the mail, and tells him he should use that knife to cut off Squanto's head. Bradford refused to do that, and this then led to a breakdown in the relationship between the groups. And Massasoit renegotiated the agreements that he had made with the Pilgrims because their crops failed that summer, and they needed his help again, but now he was in a position of greater power. Squanto died rather unceremoniously soon after this of some kind of illness. 10 years pass, and you have a great migration in 1630, and very quickly thousands of English settlers are going to settle in the completely depopulated areas of coastal New England, moving into the same villages in many cases, and communities that had been inhabited by native peoples until just a few years before. And to kind of finish the story, which I know has gone on for a while, Massasoit keeps his people together. They manage to hang on. He remains the sachem for another 50 years until one of his sons, known to us as Metacom or King Philip, launches a war against the English in 1675, which is still the bloodiest per capita conflict in American history. It's given the size of the population in New England at that point, it's an incredibly large number of people on both sides die in that war. Many people at the time noted that the Indians lost King Philip's War because they refused to engage in the same kind of total warfare, scorched earth kind of tactics that the English used. The English and their allies burned whole villages to the ground, massacring men, women, and children, elderly people indiscriminately. And the Native Americans just were not accustomed to that style of warfare, and were not prepared to engage in that kind of warfare. So that's the end of that fairly long story. But I think it's again, I think it's important because the story of Thanksgiving is such a central part of popular mythology, American mythology. It's still a national holiday, obviously, and one that I for one would never want to give up. But it's the history there behind it is actually much more interesting. And the Pilgrims didn't simply arrive in the wilderness, which is how they described it. And they weren't just simply given this land by God as they saw it, that was completely wild, and they were going to civilize this land. Rather, this disease brought by other Europeans before them arrived a few years before they did, wiped out probably 90% of the population, and they were able to move into an area that had been cleared because of something that was completely beyond their control. And they get help from this guy who walks out of the forest speaking English to them. And how crazy is that they arrive in 1620 in what they thought of as wilderness, and this guy walks out of the forest and he's speaking English. So I think the history there is pretty fascinating, and again adds a lot of complexity to the way we think about this first arrival in New England, at least. Um, now, I'm not going to talk about Jamestown in this lecture, and your textbook, has very good information, brief but and concise information, but good information about Jamestown. And I do think it's important that you understand the differences between then the settlements that follow in New England. The Pilgrims are this group of separatists who want to separate from the Church of England. They're followed by the Puritans, who want to purify the Church of England, and it's the Puritans who are much more important. They're the ones who settle Boston and Salem and the rest of the area. But then you have Jamestown in Virginia, which is a very different kind of colony. And understanding the differences between the Puritan settlements of Massachusetts and the Jamestown colony in Virginia, those first two early colonies in the 1600s, is important. So along with understanding the basic differences between the French, New France, New Spain, and the British North American colonies, and then also understanding within the British North American colonies the key distinctions between Jamestown and New England. Those are, I think, that's the way to approach this subject of early colonization in this course. So I'll stop there for now.